For most of modern history, conflict was geographically confined to a defined physical boundary, a front line. The Geneva Conventions and traditional international humanitarian law were built around this geometry. They assume an individual is either at the active front or safely in the rear echelon. Technology is now dismantling this linear model. As advanced systems become more accessible, the logic of the static barrier is failing. Precision technology and autonomous systems have decoupled warfare from these lines. They turn a nation's entire geographic footprint into an active combat zone. This puts civilian infrastructure at the same level of exposure as a forward operating base. If technology has erased the geographic rear, any strategic model that relies on the existence of a safe zone is a miscalculation. To evaluate modern conflict, we need a framework that moves beyond maps and casualty counts. We can plot the reach of war along two specific axes. The x-axis is spatial reach, the physical expansion of the battlefield driven by autonomous missile technology. The y-axis is temporal impact, the chronological expansion of war's costs, driven by destroying human capital. By synthesizing UN casualty data with causal econometrics, we can begin to plot the true hidden footprint of modern war. Failing to measure both axes results in an underestimation of what conflict actually costs a state. The data from the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine from December 2025 serves as a primary indicator of this spatial expansion. This chart breaks down casualties by weapon type, establishing the variety of the modern arsenal. 1/3 of all civilian casualties recorded here resulted from long-range strikes. These typically affect urban centers located far from the active frontline. Low-cost loitering munitions and precision systems allow actors to bypass traditional, expensive air defense networks. These cheap, mass-produced assets enable a tactical shift, where swarms of small munitions are used to overwhelm high-value strategic targets. When economic hubs are intentionally targeted, this spatial reality challenges the core humanitarian principles of distinction and proportionality. As war expands spatially, a nation's energy grids and logistics hubs effectively become the new front line. Physical destruction is the immediate spatial cost of war, but beyond the rebel lies the temporal impact, a long-term degradation of human capital. The Bosnian War of the 1990s provides a historical baseline for studying how civilian war trauma persists over time. The challenge for economists is isolating the cost of that trauma. They have to separate the psychological effects of the war from the effects of post-war poverty. This causal diagram from the IZA Institute maps the problem. War intensity drives war trauma, which then degrades mental health. This creates an endogeneity problem. A bidirectional loop between mental health and socioeconomic status makes it difficult to determine which variable drives the other. Is a survivor depressed because of the trauma they experienced, or because the post-war economy is ruined? Unless researchers can mathematically isolate the causal effect of the trauma itself, we cannot calculate the true long-term price of a conflict. To find an answer, researchers used an instrumental variable strategy, a method designed to find an exogenous shock that cuts through confounding factors. They used objective casualty rates from the Bosnian Book of the Dead as their instrument. This allowed them to filter out the noise of the post-war environment. By using this model, the researchers were able to expose the baseline impact of the trauma itself. 6 years after the conflict ended, individuals exposed to war trauma scored 1.6 standard deviations higher on clinical depression scales. This medical baseline correlates directly with labor market outcomes. Severe depression leads to reduced labor force participation and fewer working hours. This isolated trauma was responsible for an estimated 4.2% drop in the nation's total GDP. The massive economic hemorrhage caused by a heavily traumatized workforce continues long after the physical fighting has ceased. We can now return to our framework to synthesize these findings. The spatial data from Ukraine plots a point far out on the x-axis, showing that 1/3 of casualties now occur in the deep rear. The economic data from Bosnia plots a point high on the y-axis, representing a multi-decade GDP loss of over 4%. When we connect these coordinates, the area under the curve represents the true footprint of unbounded warfare. This footprint dwarfs the constrained, single point that represented the linear warfare model of the 20th century. Strategic planners can no longer rely on geographical depth for defense, just as economists can no longer assume a rapid recovery post-conflict. Modern warfare is unbounded. Defense architectures and recovery strategies must be as multi-domain and expansive as the threats themselves.